Animation enables any kind of story to be told. But the medium also carries innately sublime qualities that limit expression. The canvas is fixed to a screen, more detailed work is harder to animate, and the drawings themselves don't move, but instead have various amounts of life depending on the number of frames. On top of that, animated stories face the same kinds of constraints from film and television too. Most of them are funded by businesses with their own financial realities, goals, and timelines. And stories themselves are by their own nature limited by having a start and an end. It's common then for these factors to align and create cartoons that touch us in profound ways but then leave us wanting. So many times, the canvas feels too small for the ideas behind them. My first experience with the unintentionally sublime was on this pitifully tiny and blurry Video Now player, where I watched the original conclusion to Hey Arnold in 2003. It's honestly too perfect that I repeatedly watched its inconclusive finale so many times on a device that could barely render the faces of characters that weren't in a close-up shot. I didn't know the circumstances of that episode when I was so young, but I do remember how it made me feel. The way Arnold longs to know his parents, his hopefulness and his resignation, his excitement and malaise were so moving. Arnold gets to connect more with his parents than ever before through his father's journal, in a lighthearted, dramatic, profound way. The episode begins to end on a bittersweet note, with Arnold left with the echoes of memories from the journal, only for him to find a map of his parents' last destination. And the music swells a bit, and then poof, it's over. That rocked my little kid brain. Was this even a cliffhanger, or was the show supposed to end this way? With the mystery purposefully left to leave us in the same place as Arnold, and what about the rest of the characters? I didn't find out until being a teen that, in fact, the journal was not planned to be the end of Hey Arnold. The intended final story was a movie that took Arnold on a quest to find his missing parents, and when I found that out, it was another mind-blower, because here was this show that had a really provoking finale, and it was actually intended to be part one of the ending. It shook me to realize that shows didn't just exist, they're created and with real constraints. After the commercial and critical failure of the first theatrical Hey Arnold movie, Nickelodeon canceled production on The Jungle movie. Now, Nick did eventually work with creator Craig Bartlett again to produce that movie in their revival phase that started in 2017, but for 15 years, the journal served as the ending for Hey Arnold, and while it was partially tragic, I can't help but feel something magical about it. While it was likely very sad for Bartlett and the Hey Arnold crew, and disappointing for those who knew about the existence of the Jungle movie, there were still kids like me who accepted the journal and were mesmerized by it and did also long for more answers, but like in an inspiring way. Cartoons and television in general face economic realities all the time. They can end like Hey Arnold, or they can be even more dramatically unsatisfying like Teen Titans, or just end in the middle of what they were doing like Invader Zim. But it was Steven Universe that opened my eyes to the greater consequences of producing cartoons in the real world, and what happens when those forces clash with a very popular show. When the finale for Steven Universe Change Your Mind aired at the start of 2019, I and many other viewers were not anticipating it as the conclusion to Steven Universe. After so many seasons of build-up to the reveal of Homeworld, we expected a deep dive into the mysterious, ancient, and ultra-futuristic planet of the gems, and finally perhaps an explanation on the nature of gems themselves. But in 6 episodes, the ending narrative was tightly fixed, sans a bewildering episode about watermelons, on the family dynamics of the diamonds, and Steven's self-actualization. And we both met and resolved the personhood of White Diamond in a single shocking finale that also ended with the earliest conflict in the series resolved. So there were a few loose ends tied up for sure, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there were many other storylines and ideas that we'd been shown with the promise of future development. Although Rebecca Sugar loves sublime storytelling, surely this was too sublime an ending. Then Cartoon Network surprised us with the announcement of Steven Universe Future, an inexplicable epilogue series to a show that appeared to have been shut down prematurely. And fans speculated wildly about the premise of the series, especially with the intro of the miniseries released, showing a plethora of promising villains, and my speculation perhaps being one of the dumbest. Then we were delivered an epilogue mainly focused on Steven, dealing with his trauma, not focused on some epic space quest about the diamonds, or some new gem villains, or some new unknown enemy. Just a kid dealing with a crazy childhood. And we didn't deal with the audience's trauma of unanswered questions. It felt like something was missing in Steven Universe. There was a laundry list of lore questions and missed character opportunities. Then in October 2020, it looked like we finally had an answer. The art book, Steven Universe, End of an Era, released with comprehensive conversations from the staff of Steven Universe detailing all sorts of untold stories. But more subtly, Rebecca Sugar provided a sort of explanation on the rushed feeling of the original Steven Universe finale. After a years-long battle to have a Ruby and Sapphire wedding on screen, Steven Universe was given only 6 additional episodes to wrap up its story after reunited. Here was a show not bending to budget, or poor viewership, or poor critical reception, but stupid and bad and evil cultural and political forces. On its face, this explanation is complete and gives us a villain even. Bending to more conservative countries around the world, the multinational media studio Cartoon Network granted a single death wish to Rebecca Sugar, allowing for the most blatant LGBTQIA representation on children's television, but knowing it meant countries would not air subsequent episodes and therefore they would not grant any more. To be sure, this is absolutely a part of the Steven Universe development story. I have no doubt the series would have had a different conclusion if not for this choice by the network. But then I came across this page in End of an Era, showing that Rebecca Sugar had conceptualized About Future as a series before Change Your Mind was ever written. And then I started thinking about another show on Cartoon Network that was stopped short in its prime, OKKO, Let's Be Heroes, and then I got into thinking about what's changed and what hasn't in cartoon development over the last 20 years. Back in Hey Arnold's era, the shows of my childhood, cartoons rarely had finales or even much of an arc. They all kind of faded away, be it Samurai Jack, My Life as a Teenage Robot, Kim Possible. That's what was so surprising about Slice of Life Hey Arnold, which didn't have many ongoing storylines per se, as it did have ongoing character journeys. While I wish I could say the journal was written purely in some poetic fashion to express that feeling of inconclusive hope that Arnold experiences, it was actually written as a dare to Paramount to greenlight the Jungle movie, which didn't work because money speaks louder than satisfying endings. But it ended up standing out to me as a kid that there could be finales to shows like this. When Avatar came out on Nick, though, I think that permanently shifted audience expectations for cartoon narratives. There could be rich, emotional, intelligent storytelling, and we could expect it to be complete. Weirdly enough, even though economic realities make it hard for shows to end properly, they also make it hard for studios to want to create limited cartoons. Shows are product to big studios, and the model that worked in the late 90s and early 2000s of producing batches of a show as long as it felt pretty profitable continued to be true despite appetite for complete stories. OKKO showed what happens in modern Cartoon Network, at least, when reality butts heads with artistic vision. They seem to have learned that audiences didn't want unintentionally sublime cartoons, and when it wasn't able to commit to the full vision of OKKO, the production crew was told in advance that their show would be canceled, at a time when they could actually morph their narrative around that right before work on Season 3 started. This produced a somewhat awkward, but very smartly written, rapidly paced Season 3, and it produced one of the most beautiful and heartbreaking endings to a cartoon I've watched ever. It was a brilliant anti-cliffhanger of sorts that also felt wildly sublime, as we both saw the dozens of ideas the storyboarders had envisioned, while also experiencing right along with KO the anguish of not really getting to see them. Steven Universe couldn't build a meta, deconstructive episode like that. Should they then have risked it all to put their hopes on a movie or a follow-up series like Hey Arnold to give them the time to tell every idea they had? I can't say the strategy would have worked on Cartoon Network instead of Nick. The story they chose to tell instead was the most important one, and while it left a lot of details up for speculation, I think it produced a complete ending for the original series and gave them room to expand into future. And the series was so successful that Sugar got a movie and an epilogue season. And again, with just 20 episodes, the crew had so many ideas that couldn't fit within the canvas. That's the reality of working within television, and I don't think it's truly evil or unfair. It's what just about every show has to face. Although there were so many stories about characters like Rhodonite and backstories on the origins of the gems on the table, Sugar and the crew agreed that the story needed to focus on Steven. They recognized that there was one more piece of his journey that viewers needed to see. The hero's journey didn't stop at victory. Steven needed to face his trauma and his anger. That commitment to the original purpose of Steven Universe is crucial. It's why the show is framed around his perspective, it's why the show is sublime, and it's why it's easy to connect with the show because we have such a personal, direct relationship with the primary character. It's really hard to tell a complete story on television, maybe triply so for cartoons. Agreeing to shorter shows seems to be one ticket a la Avatar, but sometimes you sign up for a few seasons and you're not sure what will happen. I love the complicated feelings of love and loss I experience thinking about Steven Universe. Knowing the purposeful richness of the concept of the show, which has kept so many more stories outside of the frame, is frustrating yet exciting. It makes the story that was told so much more compelling in its constraint. It's the realization that entire worlds and characters exist within the creators, writers, and storyboarders that we think are more real than our own. That they've created something so real to us, we talk about characters as if they are real people in a real alternate dimension with real histories, and we categorize our own stories about them as fan fiction. And as much as we're drawn to mystery, we're drawn to stories, and stories that create a world real enough that we instinctively know the narrator has excluded details is magical. Like many shows I'm nostalgic for, like Hey Arnold, Steven Universe can't help but feel like it had so many more stories to tell. And while it would be wonderful to see some of those stories someday, I'm in awe of the commitment the crew for Steven Universe had to telling Steven's story unabridged. They didn't just balance a show that's a pastiche of their childhoods, their siblings and friends, their traumas, their fears, their passions. They told the wild, escapist story of a kid who realized he deserved to exist and be loved against the odds. There's something to be said about the appeal of unintentionally sublime endings, but I'm really impressed by Steven Universe's purposeful one.